Concrete filled my well, a thick, gray sludge flowing into the clean, cool water that had served my home for generations. My stomach dropped faster than a stone tossed into a chasm. That's right, an HOA Karen, Mrs. Gable, decided my well was an eyesore, a blight on her perfectly manicured vision of our neighborhood, and took matters into her own hands. She had no idea what she had just started, no inkling that her petty act of malice would sever the entire neighborhood's water supply with a single phone call. The silence that would soon fall over their dripping faucets and empty swimming pools would be deafening, a symphony of parched regret. Little did she know, the concrete in my well was about to become the least of her worries. My name is Alex Miller, and I live in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood called Willow Creek. For years, life here had been peaceful. Kids rode bikes, neighbors chatted over fences, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air on summer evenings. My house was one of the older ones, built by my great-grandparents, and it came with a unique feature, a private well that supplied all my water. It was a relic, certainly, but it meant I wasn't beholden to the city's water services, unlike everyone else in Willow Creek. This well had always been a source of pride, a connection to my family's past, and a quiet reassurance of self-sufficiency. I had always been careful with it, ensuring the water was clean and the wellhead well-maintained. Things started to change when the Willow Creek Homeowners Association elected Mrs. Gable as their new president. She was new to the neighborhood, having moved in just a year prior from some ritzy, meticulously controlled community. From day one, Mrs. Gable began her crusade to elevate Willow Creek. Her first targets were the small imperfections, the charming quirks that made our neighborhood feel like home. She complained about paint colors, the height of hedges, and even the type of flowers people planted. My well, nestled discreetly behind some overgrown hydrangeas, quickly caught her eye. It began with a politely worded letter. The HOA, under Mrs. Gable's new leadership, had identified my well as a non-conforming structure that detracted from the aesthetic harmony of Willow Creek. They requested I remove it, or at the very least, enclose it within an HOA-approved structure. I tried to explain that it was an active, essential part of my property, a historical feature, and that enclosing it would compromise its function. I even offered to plant more shrubs around it, making it even less visible. My explanations fell on deaf ears. Mrs. Gable simply sent more letters, each one increasingly stern, citing obscure bylaws and threatening fines. I attended HOA meetings, attempting to reason with her and the board, but Mrs. Gable had a way of steamrolling any opposition. She'd cut people off, speak over them, and dismiss valid concerns with a condescending smile. She truly believed she knew what was best for everyone, even if it meant trampling over individual property rights and common decency. Most neighbors, wary of confrontation or simply not wanting the hassle, quietly complied with her demands. They repainted their houses, trimmed their beloved rose bushes, and swapped out their garden gnomes for generic, HOA-approved lawn ornaments. I, however, refused to budge on my well. It was more than just a source of water. It was a symbol of my independence, a testament to the history of my home. One particularly sweltering afternoon, I found a bright orange sticker plastered to my wellhead. It was a final notice from the HOA, non-compliance. Immediate action required. The sticker warned of substantial daily fines if the well was not removed or obscured within 72 hours. This was beyond a simple disagreement, it felt like a personal attack. I knew Mrs. Gable had singled me out, seeing my defiance as a challenge to her authority. The next morning, as I stepped out to get the newspaper, I noticed a large, unmarked truck parked precariously close to my property line. Two burly men in work boots were unloading bags of what looked suspiciously like concrete mix. My heart hammered against my ribs. A sickening dread washed over me. They couldn't possibly be, could they? Before I could even process the thought, Mrs. Gable emerged from behind her perfectly manicured hedges, a triumphant smirk plastered across her face. She gestured towards my well, then at the men, and then back at me, as if daring me to intervene. "Mr. Miller," she called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I informed you repeatedly that this unsightly structure needed to be addressed. Since you failed to comply, the HOA has taken necessary measures to ensure compliance with our community guidelines." My jaw dropped. They were actually going to do it. They were going to fill my well with concrete. My private, ancestral well. The men started mixing, the low rumble of a portable concrete mixer filling the usually quiet morning air. I stood there, stunned, watching in disbelief as the first dollop of thick, gray concrete, like a monstrous, slow-moving slug, oozed into the opening of my well. A cold dread seeped into my bones as I watched the concrete flow, relentlessly, into the dark opening of my well. Each splash echoed like a hammer blow against my heart. It felt as though a part of my family's history, a piece of my very home, was being slowly, irrevocably buried. Mrs. Gable watched with an almost gleeful satisfaction, her eyes glinting in the morning sun. Her triumph was evident in the subtle tilt of her head, the slight curl of her lips. The burly men, oblivious or uncaring, continued their work, their faces grim and determined. The portable mixer churned, a low, grinding sound that seemed to mock my helplessness. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what was happening. This wasn't just a fine or a stern letter, this was an act of outright destruction. My mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of it. My well, my water source, my connection to generations past, was being annihilated before my eyes. The thought of losing access to my water, of being forced to connect to the city supply, felt like a cage closing in around me. It was more than an inconvenience, it was a violation. Finally, anger, hot and sharp, surged through me, replacing the initial shock. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my voice raw, barely recognizable. Mrs. Gable turned, her expression shifting from triumphant to one of feigned annoyance. "Mr. Miller, we've discussed this extensively. You failed to comply. The HOA has a duty to maintain the community's standards." Her words were hollow, devoid of any genuine concern. "You can't just destroy private property." I retorted, stepping closer, my fists clenched. One of the workmen glanced up, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but Mrs. Gable merely waved a dismissive hand. "We have every right, Mr. Miller. Your well is a nuisance and a liability. This is an official HOA action." She spoke as if reciting a pre-written script, utterly devoid of empathy. It became clear then, there was no reasoning with her. She was determined to have her way, no matter the cost to others. The concrete continued to pour, a steady, unstoppable stream. My stomach churned with a mixture of helplessness and fury. I knew arguing further was pointless, the damage was being done. Instead, I retreated inside, my mind already formulating a plan. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mrs. Gable had severely underestimated me. She thought she had won, but her victory was short-sighted, a mere skirmish in a much larger war she didn't even realize had begun. Later that day, the sickening sound of the concrete mixer finally ceased. The men packed up their equipment, leaving behind a freshly filled, hardened concrete cap where my wellhead once stood. It looked like a tombstone, a grim monument to Mrs. Gable's iron will. I walked around it, my fingers tracing the rough, unforgiving surface. The sight of it made my blood boil anew. I spent the rest of the day researching, poring over property deeds, HOA bylaws, and city codes. I discovered something crucial, a detail Mrs. Gable, in her zealous pursuit of neighborhood conformity, had clearly overlooked. Willow Creek, a relatively new development, had been built on land that once belonged to several large farms. My property, being one of the older parcels, still retained its original, historical water rights, which predated the HOA's formation and, more importantly, predated the city's water contract with the developers. This meant my well was legally protected, an independent entity beyond the HOA's jurisdiction. Their action was not just an aggressive overreach, it was an illegal act of vandalism. But that wasn't the only vital piece of information I unearthed. The developers, in their haste to connect the new homes to a reliable water source, had struck a deal with the city. Instead of building an entirely new infrastructure, they had essentially piggybacked onto the pre-existing private water lines and contracts from the older properties, including, ironically, a master connection that stemmed from the very system my well was a part of. My property, I discovered, had a unique historical easement that allowed a portion of its water rights to be leased to the city for the purpose of supplying the nascent Willow Creek development. This arrangement, decades old, had simply continued unnoticed, providing the entire neighborhood with its municipal water supply. The HOA, and even many of the current city officials, were likely completely unaware of this intricate historical detail. They saw the city water, they paid their bills, and that was that. An idea, audacious and chillingly satisfying, began to form in my mind. It was a long shot, certainly, but the more I thought about it, the more plausible it became. If my well was part of a larger, older system that the city had tapped into, and if the city's contract was linked to those historical water rights, well, then, cutting off my own water could have far-reaching consequences for the entire neighborhood. It was a risky move, one that would undoubtedly cause widespread chaos, but Mrs. Gable had left me with no other choice. She had declared war, and now it was time for me to respond in kind. The next morning, I made a series of phone calls. My first call was to my lawyer, a seasoned professional named Mr. Henderson who had handled my family's affairs for years. He listened patiently, his usual calm demeanor slowly replaced by a look of disbelief, then grudging admiration, as I laid out the history of the well and my discovery of the old water contracts. "Alex," he said, after a long pause, "this is unprecedented. If what you found is accurate, the HOA has committed a serious offense. And your idea? Well, it's certainly a bold one." He agreed to research the historical water rights and the city's current contracts immediately. My next call was to the city water department. I navigated the automated system, endured endless hold music, and finally reached a rather gruff-sounding man named Frank in the commercial contracts division. I kept my voice calm, explaining that I needed to review the terms of the original water easement connected to my property, specifically focusing on the clauses that allowed the city to draw water for the Willow Creek development. Frank sounded annoyed, clearly thinking it was a routine inquiry, but he promised to pull the old documents. I emphasized the urgency, hinting at a major legal dispute that required immediate attention to these historical agreements. The rest of the day was a tense waiting game. I tried to focus on other things, but my gaze kept returning to the concrete slab where my well used to be. Every time I saw it, the fire of determination burned brighter within me. This wasn't just about my well anymore, it was about standing up to a bully, about protecting my home, and about reminding Mrs. Gable that actions have consequences. As evening approached, Mr. Henderson called back, his voice more excited than I had ever heard it. "Alex, you were right. The original easement is ironclad. It grants the city conditional rights to draw water, with a clause that clearly states if the original private water source is intentionally rendered unusable or destroyed by a third party, the easement can be immediately terminated by the landowner." He paused, then added, "This is massive. The HOA's actions have inadvertently given you the legal leverage to cut off the city's access to that water line." A slow smile spread across my face. This was it. The moment of truth. Mrs. Gable's act of destruction had backfired spectacularly. She had filled my well, unknowingly handing me the very weapon I needed to bring her reign of terror crashing down. The city, and by extension, the entire Willow Creek neighborhood, was relying on a historical agreement tied directly to my now-destroyed well. The stage was set for a dramatic, widespread disruption that would make Mrs. Gable's concrete blunder seem like child's play. The next phone call would be the one that turned their perfectly manicured lawns into dry, cracking earth. The receiver felt heavy in my hand as I dialed the number for the city's water department again. My heart pounded a rhythmic drum against my ribs, a mixture of anticipation and a strange, almost unsettling calm. This was it. The call that would turn the tide. I asked for Frank in commercial contracts. A few moments of clicking and then his gruff voice came through the line. Frank here. How can I help you? Mr. Frank, this is Alex Miller again. We spoke yesterday about the water easement on my property, the one connected to the Willow Creek development. I kept my voice even, suppressing the tremor of excitement. Right, Miller. I pulled those old documents for you. What about, M? He sounded impatient, clearly eager to get off the phone. Well, Mr. Frank, I've reviewed them with my legal counsel, and it appears there's a rather significant clause that's come into play. I paused for emphasis, letting the words hang in the air. The agreement states that if the original private water source, which my property's well is part of, is intentionally rendered unusable or destroyed by a third party, I, as the landowner, have the right to immediately terminate the city's access to that specific water line. There was a beat of silence on the other end, longer this time. Then, Frank's voice, no longer gruff, held a note of bewildered surprise. Wait, what? Terminate access? What are you talking about, Miller? What third party? The Willow Creek Homeowners Association, Mr. Frank, I stated, my voice firm. Yesterday morning, they illegally trespassed on my property and filled my operational private well with concrete. It is now completely destroyed and unusable. Another, even longer silence stretched between us. I could almost hear the gears turning in Frank's head, the sudden shift from routine annoyance to full-blown alarm. This wasn't just a disgruntled homeowner. This was a potential catastrophe for the city's water supply to an entire neighborhood. Concrete? Frank finally stammered, disbelief evident in his tone. The HOA filled your well? Are you serious? Completely serious, Mr. Frank. I have photographs, a legal statement from my attorney, and eyewitnesses. The clause in our historical easement is clear. As of this moment, I am exercising my right to terminate the city's access to the water supply originating from my property's historical water rights, effective immediately. Panic began to creep into Frank's voice. Mr. Miller, you can't just do that. An entire neighborhood relies on that connection. This is a public utility. It's a private agreement, Mr. Frank, one that the HOA, as a third party, has directly violated by destroying my property and, by extension, the source of that very agreement. My attorney advises me that the termination is entirely within my legal rights. We can discuss the process for disconnecting the main line from the city's grid at your earliest convenience. I knew this was a dramatic step, a nuclear option, but Mrs. Gable had left me no alternative. She had attacked my home, and now she would face the repercussions. The irony was not lost on me, her attempt to control my property had now given me the power to control theirs. Frank spluttered, clearly overwhelmed. I have to get my supervisor. I'll call you right back, Mr. Miller. Do not do anything until you hear from us. He hung up abruptly, leaving me with a faint dial tone. I put the phone down, a triumphant smile spreading across my face. The first domino had fallen. The next few hours were a whirlwind. My phone rang incessantly. First, it was Frank again, much calmer but clearly rattled, informing me that his supervisor, a woman named Ms. Jenkins, the director of water operations, wanted to speak with me immediately. Then Ms. Jenkins herself called, her voice a mix of professional politeness and barely concealed urgency. She tried to reason with me, to offer solutions. Mr. Miller, we understand your frustration, Ms. Jenkins began, but cutting off water to an entire community is an extreme measure. There are hundreds of homes that rely on that supply. We can talk about damages, about legal action against the HOA, Ms. Jenkins, I interrupted. My well, a private and essential part of my property, was intentionally destroyed by the HOA. This action directly violates the terms of the historical easement that allows the city to draw water for Willow Creek. My legal right to terminate is clear. I'm not looking for damages right now. I'm exercising my legal right to protect my property and my water rights. I explained that my family had lived in that house for generations, relying on that well, and that its destruction was not merely an inconvenience but a deep personal violation. I spoke about the feeling of helplessness as I watched them pour concrete, the disregard for my protests, and Mrs. Gable's arrogant certainty. I described how the well was more than just a hole in the ground. It was a link to my great-grandparents, a symbol of independence. I hope to convey not just legal arguments, but the emotional impact of their actions. She listened, her tone softening slightly, sensing my deep conviction. I understand, Mr. Miller. This is a very serious situation. Give us some time to verify these historical documents and the implications. We need to assess the full impact. I've already had my attorney verify them, Ms. Jenkins, I replied. The ball is in your court. I'm prepared to proceed with the disconnection unless a satisfactory resolution is reached that acknowledges the severity of the HOA's actions and fully restores my property rights. I didn't explicitly say what satisfactory resolution meant, leaving it open, but my intent was clear. The concrete in my well was a non-negotiable point. After that call, the silence was almost deafening. No more calls from the city. No calls from the HOA. It was the calm before the storm, and I knew it. Word would undoubtedly spread through the city water department, perhaps even reaching the mayor's office. The implications of cutting off water to a significant portion of a residential area were enormous, far-reaching. Schools, businesses, homes, all affected. I spent the afternoon preparing. I filled every empty container I could find with water, from buckets to bathtubs. I stocked up on bottled water from the grocery store. I even pulled out an old hand pump, just in case. I knew this would not be easy, not just for the neighborhood, but for me too. There would be backlash, anger, and confusion. But I was ready. Mrs. Gable had drawn first blood, and I was simply responding to her aggression. As dusk settled over Willow Creek, a strange quiet descended. There were no sprinklers running, no kids splashing in backyard pools. A few cars drove by slowly, their occupants glancing at my property, perhaps sensing the brewing tension. I could almost feel the collective ignorance of the neighborhood about the impending crisis. They were enjoying their last moments of normal, oblivious to the fact that their water supply was hanging by a thread I was preparing to cut. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, a sleek black SUV, clearly a city vehicle, pulled up in front of my house. Two figures emerged. One was Ms. Jenkins, her face grim. The other was a stern-looking man in a suit, carrying a briefcase. I assumed he was a city attorney. This was it. The high-stakes negotiation was about to begin. They walked towards my front door, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path, and for a fleeting moment, I almost felt a pang of sympathy for them. They were about to learn just how badly Mrs. Gable's petty vendetta had backfired. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the silence of the street amplifying the anticipation. A mess. Jenkins and the city attorney, who introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, stood on my porch, their expressions solemn. The setting sun cast long shadows behind them, painting the scene with an almost theatrical tension. Ms. Jenkins spoke first, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Miller, we've verified your claims regarding the easement. It is indeed a valid and binding document. We also have confirmation of the HOA's actions. This situation is, frankly, unprecedented and extremely serious. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, his tone more legalistic. Mr. Miller, we understand your anger. What the HOA did was unacceptable and illegal. However, the city implores you to reconsider your decision to terminate the water supply. The impact on the residents of Willow Creek would be devastating. Hospitals, schools, emergency services, they all rely on that municipal water. There would be a public health crisis. He spoke of elderly residents, families with young children, and the potential for widespread panic. He painted a grim picture, one that emphasized the immense collateral damage of my actions. I listened, absorbing every word, but my resolve remained unwavering. "Mr. Harrison, Ms. Jenkins," I replied, my voice steady, "I understand the gravity of the situation. Believe me, this is not a decision I made lightly. But my property was violated. My family's history was literally cemented over. I tried to resolve this peacefully, through letters, through meetings, but the HOA, specifically Mrs. Gable, was unyielding and aggressive. They left me no choice. This is the direct consequence of their actions, not mine." I recounted the repeated attempts to reason with Mrs. Gable, the dismissive attitude, the final, humiliating act of watching the concrete pour into my well. I made sure they understood that this wasn't about petty revenge, but about standing up for what was right when all other avenues had been exhausted. Ms. Jenkins nodded slowly. "We acknowledge the HOA's culpability, Mr. Miller. We are prepared to take immediate legal action against them for property damage and illegal trespass. We will ensure your well is restored to its original condition, at their expense, and that you are fully compensated for any damages incurred. We can even offer you a temporary city water connection, free of charge, while the restoration is underway." I shook my head. "That's a good start, Ms. Jenkins, but it's not enough. Restoration is one thing, but what about the principle? What about the message this sends? That an HOA can unilaterally destroy private property with no immediate and severe repercussions? My family has owned this land for over a century. That well isn't just a utility, it's a legacy. And Mrs. Gable treated it like trash. I then proposed my terms. My demands are simple. First, the HOA must publicly acknowledge their egregious error and apologize for their actions, specifically mentioning the destruction of my well. Second, Mrs. Gable must be immediately removed from her position as HOA president and permanently barred from holding any future positions on the board. Third, a substantial financial penalty must be levied against the HOA, not just for my damages, but as a deterrent against future abuses of power. This money should go towards community improvements, overseen by a new, more responsible board. And fourth, I added, looking directly at Mr. Harrison, the city must publicly condemn the HOA's actions and ensure that such an event never happens again, perhaps through clearer regulations regarding historical property rights within HOA communities. Mr. Harrison scribbled notes on a pad, his brow furrowed. Ms. Jenkins exchanged a glance with him. This was more than they had anticipated. "Mr. Miller, those are significant demands," Ms. Jenkins stated, choosing her words carefully. "Removing an HOA president is an internal matter for the homeowners, though we can certainly apply pressure. A public apology from the HOA, a financial penalty, city condemnation, these things take time, and they involve many parties. Time is something the residents of Willow Creek won't have when their taps run dry," I responded, keeping my voice devoid of emotion. "My attorney has already prepared the formal notice of termination. It can be delivered to your department within the hour. The city has a choice: take decisive action against the HOA and meet my terms, or prepare for the very real and immediate consequences of a community without water." I emphasized the urgency. I knew this was my strongest leverage, and I wasn't going to back down. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "We appreciate your candor, Mr. Miller. We need to convene with the mayor's office immediately. This is far above our pay grade. We will call you within the hour with our proposal." They left, their faces a mixture of frustration and intense concentration. I watched their SUV drive away, the tail lights disappearing around the bend. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the weight of the impending decision. I knew they were in a bind. They couldn't afford to have a major residential area lose its water supply. The political fallout alone would be immense. Mrs. Gable's arrogance had plunged the city into a crisis, and now they had to clean up her mess. An hour later, almost to the minute, my phone rang. It was Ms. Jenkins. Her voice was strained, but there was a note of capitulation. "Mr. Miller, the mayor's office has been briefed. We understand the severity of the situation. We are prepared to agree to your terms, with a few procedural adjustments. The public apology and Mrs. Gable's removal will require a special HOA meeting, but the city will exert all its influence to ensure it happens swiftly. The financial penalty will be substantial, and the city will indeed issue a strong condemnation of the HOA's actions, publicly supporting property rights. In return, we ask for a temporary suspension of your termination notice, giving us 48 hours to implement the initial steps and schedule that HOA meeting." I considered her offer. It was a victory, a significant one. Mrs. Gable's reign was effectively over. But I still felt the sting of the concrete in my well, the audacity of her actions. "Ms. Jenkins," I replied, "I will agree to a temporary suspension of the termination notice, for 48 hours, on one condition. I want a public statement from the city, released to local news outlets within the next 12 hours, clearly stating that due to the HOA's illegal destruction of private property, the city is taking immediate action to address the situation and ensure accountability. This statement must explicitly mention the Willow Creek HOA and the destruction of my well. I wanted the public to know, to understand the cause of the coming upheaval, if it came to that. I wanted Mrs. Gable to feel the pressure, not just from the city, but from her neighbors." Another pause. "That's aggressive, Mr. Miller. But I believe we can make that happen." Ms. Jenkins sighed, a sound of weary defeat. "Consider it done. We'll be in touch with the details of the HOA meeting and the city's press release." I hung up, a profound sense of satisfaction washing over me. It wasn't just about winning, it was about making a stand. Mrs. Gable, with her insatiable need for control, had bitten off far more than she could chew. The concrete in my well was about to become the most expensive mistake she ever made, not just for her, but for the entire Willow Creek Homeowners Association. The clock was ticking for the HOA, and the whole neighborhood was about to find out why. The next morning, an unusual buzz filled Willow Creek. Residents were out earlier than usual, not just for their customary walks or dog strolls, but gathering in small clusters, speaking in hushed, excited tones. The cause of this sudden chatter was a news alert that had landed on their phones, pushed out by local media outlets. It was the city's press release, exactly as I had demanded, stark and unambiguous. It stated that the city of Willow Creek was deeply concerned by the recent, illegal destruction of private property within the Willow Creek Homeowners Association's jurisdiction, specifically the intentional damage to a historical private well. The statement went on to say that the city was taking immediate and decisive action to address this egregious overreach by the HOA and to ensure accountability, and emphasized the city's commitment to protecting the property rights of its citizens against such acts of vandalism. I saw Mrs. Gable's face as she read the news on her phone, her perfectly coiffed hair seeming to bristle with indignation. She stood on her immaculate lawn, staring at her device, her jaw slack. The usual air of smug superiority that clung to her like an expensive perfume was gone, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment, then a flicker of panic. Neighbors, who usually greeted her with deference or avoided her altogether, were now giving her sidelong glances, their whispers carrying on the morning breeze. The collective mood had shifted, and the spotlight, once on my non-conforming well, was now shining fiercely on her. Throughout the day, Mrs. Gable made frantic phone calls, her voice rising in agitated bursts that carried across the quiet street. She was clearly trying to rally support, to dismiss the city's statement as an overreaction, but it seemed her usual iron grip on the neighborhood was slipping. The sight of a local news van, emblazoned with a prominent TV station logo, slowly cruising down our street later that afternoon, seemed to confirm her worst fears. They even paused briefly outside my house, the camera lens panning towards my cemented well before moving on. The story was gaining traction, and the quiet, carefully controlled world Mrs. Gable had built was beginning to crack. Meanwhile, the city water department, true to their word, moved with remarkable speed. A team of engineers and legal representatives arrived at my house that afternoon. They conducted a thorough inspection of the well, meticulously documenting the concrete fill with photographs and measurements. The legal team conferred with Mr. Henderson, who was also present, going over the easement details and discussing the planned restoration. They assured me that the city would oversee the entire process, ensuring the well was returned to its exact original state, with advanced techniques to remove the concrete without further damage. They even brought in specialized equipment that I had never seen before, designed to delicately chip away at the hardened mass. It was clear the city was not just complying with my terms, they were making a very public show of it, a clear message to the HOA and, more importantly, to the mayor's office, that they were taking this seriously. As the sun began to set, a formal notice arrived at Mrs. Gable's doorstep, hand-delivered by a representative from the city. I watched from my window as she snatched the envelope, her face pale. This was the official notification of the emergency HOA meeting, called by the city and backed by my legal team, to address her actions and her presidency. The whispers grew louder in the neighborhood. People were openly discussing the implications, the sudden vulnerability of their water supply, and the stunning revelation that Mrs. Gable's power had been an illusion, tied to a very old and delicate thread. The residents of Willow Creek had always taken their water for granted. It simply flowed from their taps, clean and abundant. They paid their bills, complained about slight increases, but never truly considered its source. Now, with the threat of termination hanging over them, a palpable anxiety began to spread. I noticed more people collecting rainwater in barrels, filling up buckets, and even stocking bottled water from the local grocery store. The sheer idea of the water being cut off, even temporarily, was a terrifying prospect. The night before the emergency HOA meeting, I received an anonymous phone call. The caller, a nervous-sounding woman, identified herself as a longtime resident of Willow Creek. She spoke quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Miller, I just wanted to tell you, many of us, we're with you. Mrs. Gable, she's been a nightmare. But we were all too scared to speak up. We didn't know how far she'd go. Thank you for doing this." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me with a sense of quiet affirmation. I wasn't alone in this fight. Many shared my frustrations, even if they hadn't dared to voice them. The next evening, the community center, usually half empty for HOA meetings, was packed. Every chair was taken, and people stood along the walls. The air was thick with anticipation and a nervous energy. Mrs. Gable sat at the head of the table, flanked by the few remaining HOA board members who hadn't already resigned in panic. Her usual commanding presence was gone, replaced by a brittle, defensive posture. Her eyes darted around the room, meeting no one's gaze directly. Ms. Jenkins and Mr. Harrison from the city water department were there, along with Mr. Henderson, my attorney. A mess. Jenkins began by calmly outlining the city's findings, explaining the historical easement, the HOA's illegal actions, and the severe implications for the neighborhood's water supply. She didn't mince words, painting a clear picture of the city's precarious position, caught between a rogue HOA and a legal obligation to protect a private citizen's property. Then, Mr. Henderson stood up. He spoke eloquently about the sanctity of private property, the long history of my family's well, and the flagrant disregard the HOA had shown. He presented photographs of the cemented well, enlarged and projected onto a screen behind the board. Gasps rippled through the audience. Many residents, unaware of the extent of the damage, looked on in horror. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I kept it simple, factual, and deeply personal. I described watching the concrete being poured, the feeling of helplessness, and the ultimate realization that this was an act of pure spite. I spoke about the legacy of my great-grandparents, the countless glasses of clean water drawn from that well, and how it felt to see it treated with such contempt. This wasn't just about a well, I concluded, my voice resonating through the hushed room. It was about a fundamental disrespect for neighbors, for property rights, and for the very concept of community. When the floor was opened for questions, the dam broke. Resident after resident stood up, not to defend Mrs. Gable, but to express their anger and frustration. Stories poured out, of arbitrary fines, demands for unnecessary renovations, and constant harassment over minor infractions. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense anticipation to outright revolt. People, emboldened by the city's presence and my stand, finally found their voice. One particularly angry resident, a woman named Sharon, recounted how Mrs. Gable had threatened to fine her for the color of her mailbox, a mailbox that had been there for 20 years. Another, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Davies, shared how Mrs. Gable had forced him to cut down a beloved oak tree, claiming its roots threatened a sprinkler system, despite an arborist's report saying otherwise. Mrs. Gable, increasingly pale, tried to interrupt, to defend herself, but her protests were drowned out by the rising tide of discontent. Her authority had crumbled, replaced by the collective outrage of the community she had sought to control. It was a swift, brutal dethroning, executed not just by me, but by the very people she had terrorized for so long. The room was alive with a new energy, a sense of liberation, but also a growing tension as the residents stared at Mrs. Gable, waiting for her response, waiting for her to face the full weight of her misdeeds. Mrs. Gable, her face a mask of disbelief and betrayal, finally rose, her voice trembling. "This is outrageous. A witch hunt. I was only trying to protect property values, to make Willow Creek a desirable place to live." Her words were met with a chorus of angry shouts and murmurs from the now emboldened residents. The carefully constructed facade of her authority had completely shattered. The collective anger of the community, long suppressed, was now erupting like a volcano. People called out specific incidents, accusing her of petty tyranny and abuse of power. The meeting had spiraled into a public shaming, an unexpected but entirely deserved consequence of her actions. Ms. Jenkins, sensing the meeting was getting out of hand, stepped in. "Mrs. Gable, your actions regarding Mr. Miller's well were illegal and have put this entire community's water supply at risk. The city cannot and will not tolerate such behavior. Your continued leadership poses a liability." She then turned to the assembled residents. "A motion has been put forth, seconded, and will now be voted on, to immediately remove Mrs. Gable from the position of HOA president and to permanently bar her from holding any future positions on the Willow Creek Homeowners Association board." A sea of hands shot up, a resounding, unanimous vote of aye. The few who hesitated were quickly swayed by glares from their neighbors. It was a swift, decisive end to her reign. Mrs. Gable stared, aghast, at the raised hands, her eyes wide with shock. She mumbled something inaudible, then snatched her purse and stormed out of the community center, the slamming door echoing the finality of her defeat. A collective sigh of relief, mingled with quiet cheers, rippled through the room. The meeting continued for a while longer, discussing the next steps for the HOA, establishing an interim board, and planning how to move forward. The city representatives, Ms. Jenkins and Mr. Harrison, promised their full support in restructuring the HOA and implementing clearer guidelines to prevent future abuses. They also publicly reaffirmed their commitment to ensuring Mr. Miller's well was fully restored and acknowledged the critical role it had played in revealing the HOA's misdeeds. The financial penalty levied against the HOA was substantial, enough to fund significant community projects for years, effectively turning Mrs. Gable's destructive act into a source of unexpected good for Willow Creek. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood slowly began to heal. Mrs. Gable, humiliated and ostracized, listed her house for sale and moved away within a month, her perfectly manicured lawn becoming overgrown, a stark reminder of her brief, disastrous tenure. A different kind of calm settled over Willow Creek, one born not of forced compliance, but of genuine community spirit. Neighbors started talking again, really talking, sharing stories and plans for the future. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of shared purpose and newfound freedom. As for my well, the city engineers worked meticulously, using specialized equipment to carefully remove the concrete. It was a long, painstaking process, but eventually, after weeks of diligent effort, the last of the hardened cement was extracted. The well was tested, cleaned, and confirmed to be fully operational, its clear, cool water flowing once more. The city, as promised, footed the entire bill and ensured that I was fully compensated for the inconvenience. Life returned to normal, but it was a new normal, a better normal. My relationship with my neighbors had fundamentally changed. They often stopped by, bringing me baked goods, offering help with yard work, or simply chatting about the weather. They saw me not as the eccentric with the old well, but as the person who had stood up for them all, who had risked everything to bring down a bully and restore a sense of fairness to their community. The story of HOA Karen and the concrete well became a local legend, a cautionary tale told with a mix of awe and amusement. One sunny afternoon, I sat on my porch, enjoying a glass of water drawn directly from my restored well. The taste was crisp, pure, and sweeter than ever. A group of kids from the neighborhood rode their bikes past my house, laughing. One of them, a little boy named Billy, stopped, dismounted his bike, and ran up to my fence. "Mr. Miller," he called out, "my mom said you saved our water." I smiled. "Something like that, Billy," I replied. He looked at me with wide, admiring eyes. "Did you really cut off their water with a phone call?" I chuckled. "Well, it was a bit more complicated than that, but yes, you could say a phone call started it all." He grinned, then hopped back on his bike and pedaled furiously to catch up with his friends, shouting something about the water hero. I watched him go, a profound sense of peace settling over me. The concrete in my well had been a moment of extreme frustration, a violation of my home and my history. But it had also been a catalyst. It had forced me to stand up, not just for myself, but for the principle of kindness, empathy, and respect within a community. It proved that even in the face of overwhelming power, a single act of defiance, when rooted in justice, could bring about monumental change. The experience had reminded everyone, including myself, that true community thrives not on rigid rules and control, but on mutual respect and the understanding that we are all, in our own ways, connected, just like the hidden water lines beneath our seemingly separate homes.